All right, so get this. The U.S. government is saying they're working on growing meat on trees. Yeah, you heard me right. Project Arbivorous, that's what they're calling it. And well, it's got everyone talking, from scientists to farmers to, everyone who eats. So we're going to break it all down for you, from those initial news reports to the science behind it, the upsides, the downsides. By the end of this, you'll know whether to be excited, worried, or maybe a little of both.
It's just so crazy how fast this went from top secret to public.
Yeah.
Like, the government must be pretty confident this isn't some, sci-fi thing.
Right. And they're not being shy about, how big of a deal this could be. They're talking about tackling food shortages, climate change, even boosting the economy like crazy. $700 billion in revenue, millions of new jobs.
That's a lot.
Yeah, big promises.
Yeah.
But, big questions, too.
It's easy. Where you see meat grows on trees, and that's all you think about. But
Yeah.
there's some serious science going on under the hood here. It all comes down to this thing called lignocellular transmutation, which basically means scientists are figuring out how to rewrite a tree's instruction manual, I guess you could say.
Okay, so hold on. No more rings of wood. We're talking rings of ribeye now.
Yeah.
I need you to break that down a little more. Like, how do you reprogram a tree?
So imagine, right, you have these tiny little programmers, we'll call them wood bites, and you inject them into the roots of a tree. Those wood bites, they're actually enzymes. And they're like a new set of instructions, telling the tree to make muscle tissue instead of wood.
Whoa. That is wild.
Yeah, it's pretty out there.
It really is pushing the boundaries, I think, of what we thought was possible. And it sounds like they're not growing just any old meat. The USDA is saying this is basically identical to what we're used to. They can even tweak the flavor.
Yeah, that's what they're claiming. By adjusting the nutrients they give the tree, they can control things like marbling, even, create different flavor profiles. So you could be going to the meat orchard and picking between, I don't know, like a hickory smoked oak sirloin or a maple infused birch burger.
Wow. That's definitely a different way to think about, your next barbecue.
It definitely is.
So let's get into the why. The government's talking a big game about all the reasons they're doing this.
Yeah, and they're really painting a picture of a future where,
Yeah.
these meat trees are going to solve all our problems.
Right. Food shortages, climate change, jobs, the economy. But, gotta be honest, it's hard not to be a little skeptical. Can we really have our steak and save the planet too?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Okay.
The potential benefits are huge. There's no doubt about that. But
Yeah, right.
we have to look at the downsides too. And some groups, especially environmental groups, they're raising some pretty serious red flags.
Yeah. Frankenforestry. That one's sticking with me. And that picture of, a woodpecker trying to eat a steak, it makes you think.
It's a good example, I think, of how this could have consequences that we just, can't foresee. We're messing with the balance of entire ecosystems here. Forests are crucial to the health of our planet. It's not something to take lightly.
And it's not just about the environment, right? This is about our food, our relationship with nature. And I think it's clear that this is hitting a nerve with people. There have been protests all over the country.
Absolutely. People are really fired up about this. It speaks to this deeper anxiety we have,
Yeah.
about how far we're pushing technology and what it all means.
I have to say, though, some of those protest slogans are pretty clever. Trees are not T-bones. It's catchy, right?
Yeah, it's definitely memorable.
But slogans aside, what happens next? Are meat trees a done deal?
Well, the government's moving ahead with some pilot programs in a few states, Alabama, Michigan, Nevada. They want to get a better handle on the environmental impact, see how it all works in the real world.
And they're aiming to roll this out on a large scale by 2027. That's not that far off. And it's interesting, the Department of Defense is involved, too. They're saying it's to protect those pilot sites from anti-meatification extremists. That sounds pretty intense.
It definitely suggests they're anticipating some pushback.
Right. It's not just about security, is it? They're already making comparisons to the moon landing, saying this is a major turning point in history.
President Biden actually said that. Meat trees may sound unconventional, but so did the moon landing once.
It's a bold statement, but is it really the same? I mean, the moon landing, that was about exploration, national pride, pushing the boundaries of humanity, really. Yeah. This just feels different somehow.
It is different. The moon landing was about wanting to understand the universe, showing off what we could do. Project Arbivorous. It's more about, solving practical problems like food production, climate change, the economy. But I think the level of ambition, the potential for change In that way, I guess you could say, there are similarities.
It's not just about growing meat on trees, it's about potentially changing our relationship with nature and technology, like fundamentally changing it.
That's exactly it. If Project Arbivorous works, it could completely upend how we think about food production,
Mm.
resource management. Imagine, forests aren't just for timber or oxygen anymore. They're vast, self-replenishing meat farms.
Whoa. That is a mind-blowing image. But it also raises some big ethical questions, right? I mean, are we really okay with manipulating nature like this? What are the long-term consequences?
Those are the questions we need to be asking. We're in uncharted territory, and there's always that risk of unintended consequences,
Yeah.
especially when we're talking about, something as complex as an ecosystem. We've seen it before with things like invasive species
Mm.
or genetically modified crops.
And this could be on a whole other level, right? It's not just tweaking a single species or a crop. It's literally changing what forests are. And forests are so important for the health of our planet.
The government is really leaning on the sustainability angle, saying this is, way more environmentally friendly than traditional livestock farming.
And I can see how that makes sense. Livestock farming, I mean, it contributes so much to greenhouse gases, deforestation. If we could grow meat on trees, that impact could go way down.
That's the hope, but there's still so much we don't know about the environmental effects. Like what happens to the soil when it's, constantly making muscle tissue instead of wood, or the insects and animals that depend on trees. How does this affect biodiversity?
All good questions. And then beyond just the environmental stuff, there are the ethical questions too.
Absolutely. We're talking about a whole new way of interacting with nature. There are no easy answers. Before we go any further, we really need to have a conversation, a serious conversation, about the ethics, the ecology, what this means for society.
Okay, so let's imagine, just for a minute, that Project Arbivorous is a smashing success. No problems. The meat is delicious. What does that word look like?
That's a fascinating question. If meat trees become the norm, it could change everything about our relationship with food, with nature. Meat wouldn't be scarce or expensive anymore. We might look at forests as, both these natural wonders and a food source. It could be a total revolution in agriculture. We wouldn't be so reliant on industrial farming. It could even change how we design our cities, our landscapes.
It's hard to wrap your head around all the ways this could affect things. But it's clear that this is more than just some cool science experiment. This has the potential to really reshape the world.
And it's all happening so fast. The pilot programs are already going. Large-scale production is just a few years away. We're on the verge of a new era, really, and it's up to us to decide what that era is going to look like.
So what does all this mean for you? Well, it means you're living in a time where, science fiction is becoming reality. It's a time to ask tough questions, to really think about what all this means, and to, be ready for a future that might be very different from what we thought. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's take a closer look at how meat trees actually work. After all, if we want to understand the potential and the risks, we got to understand the science.
Absolutely. And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. We'll be looking at the breakthroughs that made this possible and some of the challenges they're still trying to, figure out.
So buckle up because we're going even deeper into the world of meat trees. Stay tuned.
So like we promised, let's get deeper into the science behind all of this. It really is remarkable. Bioengineering at its finest.
Okay, so walk us through it. How do they actually turn a tree into like a meat factory? It still sounds kind of crazy to me.
It is. It's cutting edge. Remember those those wood bites we were talking about? That's the key. These specially designed enzymes. They get introduced into the tree's system, and they target this layer called the cambium layer, which is basically where all the tree's growth happens.
Okay, the cambium layer, that's the part just under the bark, right?
Exactly. So in a normal tree, the cambium is, making new layers of wood cells. That's how you get those growth rings. But with wood bites, the process changes. Instead of wood cells, the cambium starts producing muscle cells, just like an animal tissue.
So it's like hijacking the tree's growth process, basically replacing wood with meat. It's wild. But I gotta ask, what kind of meat are we talking about here? Is it just like generic muscle tissue, or can they make different cuts of meat, like steak or ribs?
Now that's where it gets really interesting. The type of meat, it depends on which wood bikes they use and the nutrients they give to the tree. It's like this delicate dance of bioengineering. Researchers they're still figuring it all out,
So it's not just like inject the wood bites and wait for, I don't know, stakes to sprout from branches?
Yeah, it's much more complicated than that.
There's a lot of precision involved.
A lot of precision. It's like, programming a 3D printer, almost. But instead of plastic, you're using living cells. And by manipulating those cells, the researchers can control the texture, the fat content, even the flavor.
Okay, now I'm really picturing this meat orchard. Rows of oak trees growing ribeyes, maples dripping with bacon. It's kind of wild.
It's a whole new world, really.
But hold on, if we're talking about manipulating the tree's growth, what happens to the tree itself? Does it just keep growing meat forever?
That's a great question. And honestly, it's one of the big challenges they're still working on. Right now, the meat growth is limited to certain branches, certain sections of the tree.
Right.
You don't want the whole tree turning into meat. It still needs leaves for photosynthesis, roots to take up nutrients.
Right, right. You need the tree to stay alive, so it's more like selective harvesting.
Exactly. And that harvesting process, that's still being developed too. They're looking at, grafting branches onto existing trees. Or even, developing entirely new types of trees, ones that are designed for meat production.
So they're not just reprogramming existing trees. They're also trying to create like whole new trees.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow, that's a whole other level. But it sounds like there are still some big hurdles to overcome.
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest ones is scalability. Right now, they're mostly working with, individual trees, controlled environments. But to make this, commercially viable, they got to figure out how to do it on a large scale in real forests.
And what about safety and quality control? I mean, growing meat on trees sounds great, but people need to know it's safe to eat.
You're absolutely right. That's a top priority. They're doing, tons of testing to make sure it's free of contaminants, that it meets all the standards, and they're working on ways to, track the meat from the tree to the table, just like we do with livestock now.
It's amazing. So complex, but so exciting too. It's like we're watching a whole new industry being born, but let's step back for a minute. We've talked about the how, but what about the why? Why go to all this trouble to grow meat on trees when, we already have ways to produce meat?
Right. Well, that's where those potential benefits come in.
Yeah.
The government's hoping that meat trees can, help us solve some of the biggest problems facing the world right now.
Like climate change and food security. Can we break those down a little more? How would growing meat on trees actually help with those things?
Sure. Let's start with climate change. So, livestock farming, as it is now, it's a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, water pollution. Meat trees could be, a much more sustainable option.
Because trees absorb carbon dioxide, right?
Exactly. And they don't produce methane, which is a really potent greenhouse gas. Plus, meat trees wouldn't require all that land, water, and feed that livestock need.
Okay, so there's the environmental side. What about food security? How would meat trees help feed, a growing population?
Well, think about it. Forests cover, a huge percentage of the Earth's land. If we could use even a small part of that for meat production, it would significantly increase our food supply.
And make meat, more affordable, more accessible for people in developing countries.
Exactly. Meat trees could really be a game changer for regions struggling with hunger. And it could help us move away from industrial farming, which, has its own ethical and environmental problems.
So it's not just about the meat. It's about, creating a better food system overall.
Exactly. That's what makes Project Arbivorous so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's not just about growing meat on trees. It's about rethinking our entire relationship with food, with nature, with technology in a way that could benefit everyone.
It's a vision of the future that's both inspiring and kind of unsettling, I guess.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
It is, and I'm sure our listeners have a lot of questions right now. So let's take a break, give everyone a chance to process all of this, and when we come back, we'll dive into some of the potential risks, the ethical concerns. Stay tuned. Okay, so we've talked about the science, the potential upside of meat trees, but now I think it's time to, address the elephant in the room. What are the risks? What could go wrong?
Yeah, that's the important part, right? With any new technology, there's always uncertainty. And Project Arbivorous, it's no different. We have to talk about the potential downsides, even if they're, a little scary to think about.
And let's be real. Not everyone is on board with this whole meat tree thing. We've seen the protests, the slogans. There's definitely some anxiety out there. What are some of the main concerns that you're hearing?
I think one of the biggest ones is the potential impact on the environment. I mean, forests are incredibly complex, and even small changes can have, you know,
Yeah.
a ripple effect.
Right. We've talked about frankenforestry, that idea that, we're messing with nature in ways we don't fully understand. It's like that saying, nature bats last. Are we opening Pandora's box here?
It's a valid concern.
What are some of the specific ecological risks that scientists are worried about?
Well, there are worries about biodiversity, for example.
Hmm.
What happens to the insects, the birds, the animals that depend on, traditional trees?
Right.
Will meat trees outcompete native species? Disrupt the balance of the ecosystem? Those are all questions we need to answer
Yeah.
through research, careful monitoring.
And what about the soil? I mean, we talked about how meat trees could reduce deforestation, but what about the soil itself? Could growing all this muscle tissue deplete nutrients, change the soil composition in ways that are harmful?
That's another valid point. Soil health is, I mean, it's crucial for any kind of agriculture.
Yeah.
And meat trees are, they're no exception. So researchers are looked into that, studying the impact on the soil
Yeah.
to make sure that, this is actually sustainable in the long run.
So it's not just like plant trees and everything's fine. There's a whole ecosystem to think about. But let's move beyond the environmental stuff for a minute. What
Yeah.
about, the social and economic implications? This has the potential to disrupt entire industries.
It does. If meat trees become, a major source of meat, it could have a huge impact on livestock farmers, meat packing plants, the whole agricultural system. So we need to think about how to manage that transition in a way that's fair to everyone.
Right. We don't want to, solve one problem and create a bunch of new ones. And what about consumers? I mean, will people actually eat meat grown on trees? It's a pretty radical concept.
It is. It's a big question mark. I mean, consumer acceptance is going to be, what makes or breaks this whole thing. There's definitely a yuck factor to some people. And people want to know, does it taste good? Is it safe? Is it affordable?
No.
Well,
It's like, remember when plant-based meat first came out? Some people were all about it. Some people were like totally grossed out. It took time for people to come around.
It did. It took time.
And let's talk about the government's role in all this. They're obviously, putting a lot of weight behind meat trees. But some people are wondering, what's the real motivation? Is this really about solving problems, or is there something else going on?
Well, I think it's always good to, be a little skeptical, especially when it comes to, big government projects like this. Some people are worried that this is just a way for the government to control the food supply. Others are worried about, big corporations taking over, creating monopolies.
So there are concerns about, who's really in charge, who benefits. And let's not forget about unintended consequences. We've seen it so many times with new technology. Things don't always go according to plan.
That's right. There's always that risk. It's impossible to predict everything, especially with something as potentially transformative as this. So we have to be, prepared to adapt, to deal with the unexpected.
So it sounds like there's a lot of uncertainty here, a lot of, what ifs. What's the takeaway message for our listeners? What should they be thinking about?
I think the most important thing is to approach this with, both curiosity and skepticism. Project Arbivorous, it has amazing potential, but it's not, a magic solution. We need to talk about it, to really consider the benefits and the risks. And we need to hold our leaders accountable to make sure they're making responsible decisions.
It's a time for, informed debate, not just reacting out of fear or excitement. And ultimately, it's up to each of us to decide how we feel about meat trees and what role we want them to play in our future.
I think that's a great way to put it.
So that's it for our deep dive into meat trees. The science, the potential, the risks, the ethics. It's a lot to process, but hopefully this has given you the information you need to form your own opinions, to have those important conversations about the future of food and our relationship with nature.
We're living in a fascinating time, and it's more important than ever to stay curious, to stay informed, to keep asking questions.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.